The morning Olive Rhodes walked into the Harlan Creek Town Hall with 63 signatures on a folded piece of paper. Not a single man in that room looked up from his pipe long enough to read what she had written. It was the spring of 1878, and the Kansas sun was already pressing hard against the windows of the low adobe building that served as Harlan Creek's seat of government, such as it was. The town had a mayor named Fitch, a man whose belly preceded him into every room and whose opinions followed close behind, unwilling to be left out. There was Deputy Rand Colton, lean and lazy in equal measure, propped against the far wall with his arms folded. There was Herbert Dawes, who ran the general store and acted as though commerce gave him a kind of royalty. And there was old Thomas Priel, who had been on every town committee since 1861, and mostly served the function of nodding at whatever Fitch said. Olive had spent 3 weeks writing that petition. She had walked every road in Harlan Creek and the 2 miles outside it, knocking on doors, explaining herself clearly and patiently to anyone who answered. She had spoken to the women who washed laundry behind the saloon, to the Mexican families who farmed the creek bottomland, to the widow Clara Sims who ran a boarding house on the East Road, to the schoolteacher Miss Vance who had arrived in 1876 and hadn't stopped being startled by the place since. 63 people had agreed with her. 63 people had pressed their names or their marks into the paper. What Olive was asking for was not radical by the standards of anywhere sensible. She was asking the town to fund a physician's salary so that Harlan Creek could have a permanent doctor. The town had lost its previous doctor, a man named Aldridge, to a cholera scare in the fall of 1877. Since then, people had been riding 22 miles to the next settlement whenever something serious happened, and several people had not made it. A woman named Florence Garrett had died in February trying to deliver her second child. There had been no one qualified to help her. Olive had been there. She had held Florence's hand. She had watched. So she had written her petition carefully, outlining the deaths, the distances, the costs, the existing fund the town had set aside for civic improvements that was sitting largely untouched. She had calculated the numbers. She had even listed 3 physicians from Wichita and Abilene who had expressed interest in frontier postings. It was a thorough document. It was reasonable. It was the kind of thing that deserved to be read by men who called themselves leaders. Fitch took the paper from her hand without unfolding it, set it on the table in front of him and said, "We appreciate your concern, Miss Rhodes. The committee will review this in due time." Then he asked Herbert Dawes whether the road widening project was coming along. Olive stood at the edge of the room for a moment, looking at the folded petition sitting on the table like a piece of rubbish someone had set down before finding a bin. She felt the heat rise into her cheeks, and she kept her voice level with the particular discipline that comes from being a woman who has had to be disciplined her entire life. "It concerns people who have already died, Mayor Fitch," she said. Fitch looked at her with the expression of a man who found her persistence mildly inconvenient. "Yes, well, that's the frontier for you, Miss Rhodes. We're doing our best." She walked out of the town hall into the full brightness of a Kansas morning, stood in the packed dirt of the main street, and breathed very slowly. She was 26 years old and had been in Harlan Creek for 4 years, having come originally from Ohio with her father who had died of a lung infection in 1876. She ran the small property he had left her, kept a kitchen garden, did mending work and took in a boarder when she could find a respectable one. She was not wealthy. She was not connected. She was a woman without a husband in a town that arranged its priorities accordingly. She was not going to cry in the street. She was also not going to stop. 3 days later, she was rewriting the petition, this time planning to address it directly to the county seat at Grover's Pass, when she heard the sound of a horse coming down the East Road at a pace that suggested something purposeful. Most people in Harlan Creek moved at a pace that suggested nothing at all, so the sound was distinctive. She was sitting on the porch of her small house, which sat on a modest lot at the edge of town, with the draft of her letter on her lap. She looked up. The rider was a man she had not seen before. He was tall in the saddle, not dramatically so, just the particular tallness of someone accustomed to carrying themselves with a kind of easy uprightness. He rode a dark bay horse with one white sock, and he had the look of someone who had been on the road for several days. Dust settled into the creases of his jacket, and the brim of his hat marked by weather. He was perhaps 28 or 29, with a jaw that held a few days of dark stubble and eyes that, even from a distance, seemed alert in a way that went beyond mere watchfulness. He slowed as he came into town, and he did what most strangers did, which was look around, taking stock of the place, deciding what kind of town it was. Olive had watched many strangers do this and had always been vaguely sorry for what they concluded. He stopped at the water trough near the livery, let his horse drink, and then spoke briefly to old Silas Hatch, who ran the livery. Silas pointed toward the center of town, and the man touched the brim of his hat in thanks and walked his horse slowly in that direction. Olive went back to her letter. She did not think about the stranger again until the following afternoon, when she went to Herbert Dawes' general store for flour and thread, and found him there, speaking to Herbert across the counter with the easy manner of someone asking directions or inquiring about a room. Herbert was answering him with his usual combination of helpful information and low-grade suspicion toward anyone new. The stranger glanced over at the sound of the door, and Olive saw his face properly for the first time. There was something open about it, not naive, but genuinely attentive, the face of a man who looked at things because he was actually interested in them. He had a straight nose and a slight seriousness around the brow that was contradicted somewhat by the fact that he looked, at that moment, as though Herbert's information was both less than he needed and more than he wanted to hear. "Morning," he said, since Olive was the only other person in the store. "Good morning," she said, and went to find her flour. Herbert finished with him, and the man gathered what he had bought, which appeared to be a small quantity of provisions, and made for the door. Then he paused. "Excuse me," he said, and Olive looked up. He was looking at her with a directness that was not rude but was certainly not shy. "You wouldn't happen to know if the town is still looking for anyone to fill the surveying work on the irrigation project? I was told in Abilene there might be something here." "I wouldn't know about that," Olive said. "You'd want to speak to Mayor Fitch. He keeps the civic contracts." The man made a small expression that suggested he had already heard something about Mayor Fitch. "Right," he said. "Thank you," he left. Olive stood in the flour aisle and was not sure why the mundane exchange had felt in some small way like a door being opened. His name was Owen Talbot, and she learned this from Clara Sims at the boarding house, who mentioned it in the way Clara mentioned everything, as a piece of social currency offered freely. "He's taken the small room at the back," Clara said when Olive came for tea that Friday, as she often did. "Very polite, pays in advance. He's done surveying work all across the territory, apparently. Was up in Nebraska for a time and before that somewhere in Colorado." "Is he staying long?" Olive asked, without particular intent. "He's not sure," Clara said, which was an unusual answer. Most men who came to Harlan Creek either stayed because something held them or left because nothing did. Indecision was not a common posture. Olive thought about that. It was another 5 days before she spoke to Owen Talbot properly, and it happened because of a mule. She had borrowed Thomas Preel's mule to carry some timber she needed for a repair to her fence, and the mule, whose character was entirely opposed to cooperation, had decided midway through town to sit down. Not in a metaphorical way. The animal had simply lowered itself into the road with the air of one who had made a philosophical decision and would not be moved by argument. Olive was standing in the street, holding the lead rope, explaining her position to the mule in plain and logical terms, when Owen Talbot came out of the hardware store on the opposite side of the road. He stood for a moment watching her, and the mule with what she could only describe as respectful curiosity. "He's been like this for 15 minutes, she told him. because he was looking and because explaining the situation to a human seemed more productive than continuing to explain it to the mule. "They generally respond better if you stop pulling," Owen said, walking across to her. "I have stopped pulling." Completely stopped, not even holding the rope tense. She looked down at her hands and released a tension she had not consciously been applying. The rope went slack. A full minute of silence passed, during which Owen crouched down and appeared to examine something about the mule's front right leg without touching it. "There's a stone under his hoof," Owen said. "Just there. He's been telling you something." He produced a small folding knife from his pocket, and with the careful, practiced motion of someone who understood animals, he worked the stone free. Then he stepped back and waited. Another 30 seconds of stillness, and the mule got up. Olive stared at the mule, then at Owen. "Thank you," she said. She felt unreasonably as though she had failed an exam she hadn't known she was taking. "He wasn't being difficult," Owen said, in a tone that was not condescending but was simply observational. "He was asking for something." "I can see that now," she said. He picked up the lead rope and handed it to her, and their fingers were close together for a moment but did not quite touch. He looked at the timber in the cart. "Fence repair. The north side of the property. A post rotted through." "That's a fair amount of timber for one post." "I'm reinforcing the whole section while I'm at it," she said. "No point doing half a job." He looked at her as though that answer told him something useful. "No," he said. "I suppose there isn't." He tipped his hat, which was not a grand gesture but a natural one, and walked on. Olive continued to the property, unloaded the timber, and spent the rest of the afternoon working the fence with methodical energy, pausing occasionally to think about nothing in particular, which she recognized was not quite true. The following week brought a new development, and not a welcome one. Mayor Fitch announced at the regular Thursday town meeting, to which Olive was not officially invited but attended anyway, that the Civic Improvement Fund was going to be used to expand the saloon's back annex and resurface the main road. The total outlay would use most of what was available. Olive sat in the back row and felt something cold and distinct move through her. She raised her hand. Gerald Fitch looked at her with the resignation of a man who had known this was coming. "Miss Rhodes," he said. "The fund was intended for civic improvements that serve the population," she said. "There are 3 families in this town who lost members last winter because we have no physician. My petition addresses this directly and includes specific cost analysis. It was submitted 3 weeks ago. Has the committee reviewed it?" Gerald Fitch glanced at Thomas Priel and Herbert Dawes. "We've discussed it," he said, with an authority that gave no information. "Then you'll have read the section where I calculated that a physician's annual salary, even with a housing supplement, comes to less than the road resurfacing alone." There was a pause that lasted slightly too long. "The committee has weighed the priorities," Gerald Fitch said. "The road serves everyone daily." "The road doesn't bury children," Olive said. The room was quiet. Deputy Colton looked at his boots. Thomas Priel cleared his throat. Herbert Dawes began examining his sleeve. "Meeting's moving on," Gerald Fitch said. Olive walked home through the warm spring evening with the specific fury of a person who knows they are right and cannot make it matter. She sat on her porch in the dark for a long time, watching the stars come out over the flat Kansas plain, which did not care about town councils or petitions or women who had watched Florence Garrett die in February. She was going to write to the county seat in Grover's Pass. She was going to write to the Territorial Health Board in Topeka. She was going to write to everybody with any authority over small towns in the state until one of them paid attention. She had no way of knowing whether it would work. She was going to do it anyway. She heard boots on the road and looked up. Owen Talbot was walking past, coming from the direction of the town hall, and he glanced over and saw her sitting in the dark. He stopped. "Rough meeting," he said. She looked at him. "Were you there?" "I was at the back. I've been trying to understand how this town makes its decisions. It's a professional interest since I'm hoping to bid on the irrigation survey." "And how do you find it makes its decisions?" He was quiet for a moment. "Poorly," he said, with a simplicity that almost made her smile. That's a generous summary, she said. He stood at the edge of the road, not quite at the gate of her property, with the manner of a man who was considering something. The petition you mentioned, he said. Is it public, the document itself? It was submitted to the town, she said. So technically it belongs to their records. I have my draft copy. Would you be willing to let me read it? She looked at him for a moment, trying to understand the question. Men in Harlan Creek did not generally ask to read her work. They listened to summaries of it with politely suppressed impatience. Why? She said. Because you mentioned it twice in that meeting and they talked around it both times, he said, and I'd like to know what they're talking around. She went inside and came back with the draft, which was 8 pages in her clear, close handwriting. She handed it to him through the gate. I'll bring it back tomorrow, he said. She nodded. He walked on toward the boarding house. Olive stood on her porch for another few minutes, then went inside and went to bed, and lay awake for a while thinking that she had just given a near stranger 8 pages of her most careful thinking, which was either a reasonable thing to do or the beginning of something she hadn't planned. He brought it back the next morning at 8 o'clock while she was working in the kitchen garden. She heard the gate and straightened up, and he was there, hat in hand, which she had already come to understand was the posture he assumed when he was being serious about something. He held out the pages. You referenced the wrong statute, he said. She took the pages. What? Page 3, where you cite the Civic Improvement Act of 1873. That statute was superseded in 1875 by an amendment that actually strengthens your case. The 1875 amendment specifically includes medical services in the definition of essential civic infrastructure. Your petition is citing the weaker precedent. She stared at him. How do you know that? I spent a lot of time in county offices during my surveying work, he said. You read a lot of statutes when you're trying to get land surveys recognized. I've read the Kansas Civic Code more times than I'd recommend to anyone. Olive looked down at page 3. He was right. She had found the 1873 Act in the reference materials available at the Harlan Creek post office, which were several years out of date. There's also, he said, with the careful tone of a man not sure how the next part will land, a provision under the county health charter that allows a petition with more than 50 signatures to compel a formal review by the county health office. Not the town, the county. They have to respond in writing within 30 days. She looked up at him. That's on page 6 of my document, she said slowly. I was going to pursue the county anyway. I know, but you have the mechanism to compel them. That's different from asking. If you refile with the corrected statute and invoke the county health charter provision, they can't ignore it the way Fitch ignored it. Olive set the pages down on the fence post and looked at him with the particular attention she gave to things that mattered. You read every word, she said. Yes, he said. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because it was worth reading, he said, and there was nothing performative in his voice, just the simple statement of a man who meant what he said. What you wrote is accurate and it's well-reasoned, and it makes a clear moral case. The fact that Fitch hasn't read it doesn't mean it doesn't deserve to be read. Something shifted in Olive's chest. It was not a dramatic thing, more like a piece of furniture being moved slightly so that the room made more sense. Thank you, she said. I have the county charter citation if you need it, he said. I can write it out. Please, she said. He came through the gate and she moved aside to give him room at the fence post, and he produced a small notebook from his jacket pocket, the kind a man in his profession would carry, and wrote out the citation in a clear, economical hand. She watched his handwriting and thought it suited him, which was not a thought she had expected to have. He tore out the page and handed it to her. The county office is in Grover's Pass, she said. I know, 22 miles east. She looked at him. I'm going to ride out there and refile in person. If you write them, they have more room to lose things. That's probably wise, he said. Would you be willing to come, she asked, and she heard how direct it sounded and did not walk it back. I don't mean as anything other than a practical matter. You know the statutes and the charter. If they push back on the filing, it would help to have someone there who can cite the precedent without looking at notes. He looked at her for a moment, and she could not quite read his expression, only that something moved in it. Yes, he said. When? Thursday, she said. The county office is open Tuesday through Friday. Thursday works, he said. He put his notebook back in his jacket and turned to go, then stopped. Miss Rhodes, he said, for what it's worth, the section where you described Florence Garrett's death, that was the clearest piece of writing in the document, and I think it's the section that will matter most. Don't cut it for professional tone. Leave it exactly as it is. She hadn't planned to cut it. But the fact that he had thought about it enough to say so made the morning feel, for the first time in several weeks, like something other than a long argument she was losing by herself. The ride to Grover's Pass on Thursday was 22 miles of flat Kansas country, which is not beautiful in any conventional way but has a particular honesty to it. The sky enormous and the land beneath it stripped of pretension, everything visible for miles in every direction. They left at first light to have time in the office before noon. Owen rode a dark bay horse he had rented from Sela's, and Olive rode her own horse, a brown quarter horse mare named Alice who had belonged to her father. They rode at an easy pace that allowed for conversation, and the conversation came naturally, which surprised Olive, who was not accustomed to natural conversation with men about anything beyond practical matters, and had assumed that even if it existed, it would not exist here, on the Kansas plain, with a man she had known for 2 weeks. She learned that Owen had grown up in Missouri, outside of St. Louis, the second of 4 children. His father had been a cartographer, which was where Owen's interest in land and measurement had come from. He had studied briefly at a college in St. Louis before the family's financial circumstances changed, and then he had taken to the field, which he did not say with regret, only with the factual acceptance of someone who had made the best of a redirection. He had been in Kansas for 6 months, moving through several towns on contract work. Harlan Creek was the longest he'd stayed anywhere in a while. Why? She asked. He looked at the road ahead. I haven't found a reason to move on yet, he said, and the way he said it was not quite the same as what it literally meant, and she felt that difference but did not press it. She told him about Ohio, about her father, about the 4 years in Harlan Creek that had started as something she'd meant to be temporary and had quietly become permanent. She told him about Florence Garrett without planning to, and he listened in the particular way he seemed to have for things that mattered completely without filling the silences. It changed what you were willing to tolerate, he said when she had finished. Yes, she said. Good, he said simply. The county office in Grover's Pass was a more substantial building than anything in Harlan Creek, with a proper clerk's window and 2 officials who wore the expression of men accustomed to managing a significant flow of unremarkable paperwork. The senior official was a man named Aldridge, no relation to the former doctor, and he looked at Olive's petition with the standard early skepticism of someone deciding how much energy to invest. Owen stepped forward and said, very calmly, "You'll note on page 3, the petition cites the Civic Improvement Act of 1875, specifically the amendment that includes medical services under essential civic infrastructure. And on page 4, you'll see the invocation of the county health charter provision under section 12, subsection C, which requires a formal written response from the county within 30 days of a petition signed by 50 or more residents." Aldridge looked at him, then looked at the petition, then looked at Owen again. "You've read the charter," he said. "I have," Owen said. There was a pause in which Aldridge recalibrated his approach to this particular filing. The petition was accepted, properly stamped, and formally logged as a Section 12 filing, which was an entirely different category than the general suggestions pile. Aldridge said the 30-day response window began today. They walked out of the county office into the Grover's Pass street, and Olive stood in the sun for a moment and felt something uncoil in her chest that had been wound tight for months. "It won't guarantee anything," Owen said beside her. "I know," she said, "but it guarantees they have to respond. That's different from nothing." She looked at him. "You were very good in there. You wrote a very strong petition," he said. "I just made sure they couldn't pretend otherwise." They had a meal at a small restaurant in Grover's Pass before the long ride back. A simple meal of beef stew and bread, served by a tired woman who brought them coffee without being asked. It was the kind of meal that becomes something else when you are sharing it with someone whose company you find genuinely good. "Tell me about the irrigation project," Olive said. He explained it. A canal survey to determine the feasibility of extending water access to the farming settlements south of Harlan Creek, mostly Mexican families who had been there longer than the town itself in some cases. The project, if it went forward, could make a significant difference to their ability to farm through the dry season. Mayor Fitch approved that one, Olive said. He approved the survey, Owen said. That's different from approving the project. I suspect he approved the survey because someone told him there might be money in the land around the canal route. Whether the canal itself ever gets built depends on who wants it built and who doesn't. Olive looked at him. "You're cynical." "I'm observant," he said without heat. "There's a difference." "Is there?" he considered. Cynicism assumes the worst and stops looking. Observation assumes nothing and keeps looking. He looked at her steadily. "You're not cynical. After everything Fitch has done with your petition, you still went to the county. That's not cynicism. That's the opposite of it." She held his gaze. "Sometimes I feel like the opposite of it," she said honestly. "I know," he said, "but you do it anyway." The ride back was longer in the late afternoon heat, and they spoke less, comfortable in the quiet that had developed between them, which is itself a form of intimacy, the freedom to be silent with another person without it meaning anything bad. When they reached the edge of Harlan Creek as the sun was going low and painting the plain in shades of copper and gold, Olive glanced over at Owen and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away for a moment, just rode in that amber light with the sound of the horses and the distant cry of some prairie bird, and it was enough, for that moment, to simply be in it. "Thank you," she said again, as they reached the town. "You don't have to keep thanking me," he said. "I'll stop when I stop meaning it," she said. He smiled at that, a full smile, not the restrained version he usually offered, and it changed his face entirely, and she thought that she would not mind seeing that smile again for a long time. The next several weeks settled into a rhythm that neither of them had designed, but both of them tended with a kind of quiet care. The irrigation survey required Owen to spend long days in the field south of town, mapping the creek and its tributaries, taking elevation readings, marking the land with the precise attention his work demanded. He sometimes returned to Clara's boarding house at dusk covered in dust, and sometimes he came past Olive's property on his way back, and sometimes he stopped, and sometimes she was on the porch, and they talked. She was working on her letters to the Territorial Health Board in Topeka in the meantime, refining and expanding what she had submitted to the county. She had also started something she hadn't initially planned, a record of all the medical incidents in Harlan Creek going back 4 years, gathered from neighbors and from the records at the post office and from her own memory. It was meticulous and painful work, and Owen asked about it one evening and she explained it, and he said, "That will be hard for anyone to argue with," and she said, "That's what I'm counting on." He had brought her a survey map one evening, not a finished document but a working draft, and spread it on the table inside her house while she made coffee, and showed her where the proposed canal route would run. "If they build this," he said, pointing, "the Herrera family's land becomes viable in a way it hasn't been since the drought in '74. Same for the Ray's parcels along here." She looked at the map and then at him. "Do they know that?" "I told them." "Rafael Herrera speaks good English." He translated for some of the others. He paused. "They're cautious. They've had promises before." "This town has a history of those," Olive said. He looked up. "Has anyone spoken up for them at meetings, in the same way you've spoken up about the physician?" She was quiet for a moment. "I've raised it. Fitch says the survey will take care of itself. He means he'll wait to see who profits before he commits." "Yes." Owen was quiet, rolling the map slightly. "I'll make sure the survey report is unambiguous," he said. "I can't control what they do with it, but I can make sure there's no wiggle room in what the land says." She looked at him across the table, in the warm light of the oil lamp with the smell of coffee and the sound of the evening outside, and she thought that she had never met a man quite like this, someone who applied the same basic seriousness to everything in his life, to the land he mapped and the statutes he read and the conversations he had. He did not perform goodness. He just was, as quietly and consistently as a compass needle pointing north. "You're a careful man," she said. He looked at her. "I've found that careful pays better than careless," he said, "in all kinds of work." The way he said it and the way he was looking at her when he said it made the word work feel like it contained more than one meaning. "Is that so?" she said. "Generally," he said, and his voice was quieter than it had been. The silence between them was different from the comfortable silences they had shared before. It had weight in it and possibility, and neither of them was quite ready to name it yet, which was all right. Some things deserve the space to arrive on their own. The county's response came exactly 27 days after the filing, which was 3 days before the deadline and was itself notable. Olive received it via the post rider, a thick envelope with the official Grover's Pass seal, and she opened it on the porch with hands that were steadier than she expected. The county had reviewed the petition and the supporting documentation. They had found it to be filed correctly under Section 12 of the County Health Charter. They had further found that the case for a permanent physician in Harlan Creek was adequately substantiated. They were ordering Mayor Fitch to convene a formal public meeting within 14 days to address the matter, and they were attaching a list of physicians currently available for frontier placements through the state's medical placement program. If the town failed to act, the county retained authority to allocate a portion of the town's civic fund directly. Olive read the letter 3 times, sitting on her porch in the morning sun. Then she walked directly to Owen's boarding house. Clara answered the door and said he had gone out early, and Olive asked which direction, and Clara pointed south, toward the survey area. Olive saddled Alice and rode. She found him in the bottomland 1/2 mile south of town, kneeling in the grass with his surveying instruments around him, making notes in his field book. He heard her coming and stood, shielding his eyes against the sun. She rode up and stopped Alice and looked down at him and held up the letter. "They responded," she said. He looked at her face and understood before he read a word. Something in his own face shifted, a warmth that was not easy to name but was completely real. "Read it to me," he said. She read the whole letter aloud, sitting on Alice with the letter in both hands and the spring sun on her face and the creek running softly somewhere below them. When she finished, she looked down at him. He was looking up at her with an expression she had never quite seen on any face before. It was not just happiness at a positive outcome. It was something more specific, the look of a person seeing someone else win something they entirely deserved and finding that more satisfying than any personal victory. "You did that," he said. "You found the statute," she said. "You wrote 63 people into signing a paper for a town that didn't want to hear it," he said. "You did that. The statute was a tool. The work was yours." She looked at him in the bright morning. She felt something she had not felt in a very long time, which was the uncomplicated warmth of being fully seen. Not managed, not patronized, not ignored. Seen. "Owen," she said, and his name felt different in her mouth than other names. "Olive," he said just as quietly, and her name in his voice was not a formality. She dismounted because it was too far to look at him from horseback, and he stood where he was, not moving toward her, giving her whatever space she needed. She walked to him. "I want to say something," she said. "All right," he said. "I don't do this. I don't rely on people. I don't invite people in. I've been managing alone for long enough that I don't always know how to do anything else." "I know," he said. "But I want to tell you that these weeks, having someone who read what I wrote and thought it was worth reading." She stopped because her throat was being unhelpful. "That has mattered to me more than I know how to say properly." He looked at her for a long moment, and the Kansas wind moved through the grass around them and the creek ran. "You don't have to say it properly," he said. "I understood it from the first morning." "From the mule," she said, and there was almost laughter in it. "From the mule," he confirmed, and there was. He reached out and took her hand, not urgently, just gently, as though completing a gesture that had been interrupted several weeks ago in the hardware store doorway. "I am also not someone who does this," he said. "I have been in a lot of towns, and I have not wanted to stay in any of them. I want to stay in this one, and that's not about the irrigation survey." She looked down at their joined hands and then up at his face. "I'm glad," she said. He lifted her hand slightly, just enough to show he was aware of holding it, and that he intended to keep doing so. "So am I," he said. The mandatory public meeting that Mayor Fitch was required to convene happened 10 days later, and it was unlike any town meeting Harlan Creek had held before, because this time people came. Word had spread about the county's order, as word in small towns always does, through the post rider and Clara's boarding house and Herbert's store, and the natural osmosis of a community where everyone's business is eventually everyone else's. The women who had signed Olive's petition came. The families from the bottomland farms came. Rafael Herrera in a clean white shirt translating quietly for those who needed it. Clara Sims came and sat in the front row with her arms folded. Miss Vance, the schoolteacher, came with a notebook. Olive sat near the front and Owen sat beside her, and his knee was close to hers, and neither of them moved away. Gerald Fitch opened the meeting with the expression of a man attending his own sentencing. He read the county's order. He opened the floor for discussion. What followed was 2 hours of the most sustained civic engagement Harlan Creek had produced in years, and nearly all of it supported Olive's position. People who had been hesitant to sign her petition spoke in public about the winter deaths. Clara Sims said plainly that Florence Garrett's death had been preventable and that the town had known it and done nothing. Rafael Herrera spoke about his youngest child, who had been sick in January and could not receive care for 3 days because of the distance. Miss Vance read aloud from Olive's petition, the section about costs and the section about Florence, and the room was very quiet during both. Mayor Fitch said he had always supported the idea of a physician. Herbert Dawes said much the same, with the particular blandness of a man revising history. In the end, by a show of hands that was not really close, the meeting voted to allocate funds from the Civic Improvement Reserve for a physician's housing and salary, and to write immediately to the medical placement program in Topeka. The vote was not the end of everything. There would be correspondence and waiting, and the complicated business of actually placing and retaining a doctor. But it was a beginning that was real, not deferred, not filed away to be forgotten. Walking out into the warm evening after the meeting, Olive felt a lightness she did not entirely trust yet, because she had learned to be cautious about how quickly good things could become complicated again. But it was there, the lightness, undeniable. Owen walked beside her and said nothing for a while. "How do you feel?" he said eventually. "Strange," she said. "Like I've been pushing something uphill for so long that now it's moving. I'm not sure what to do with my hands." He laughed softly. "I think you'll find something." "I always do," she said. "I'm just not used to finding it without feeling like I'm fighting." He slowed slightly, and she slowed with him, and they were a little behind the others now in the blue-gray dusk of the Kansas evening. "You don't have to fight alone anymore," he said, and the simplicity of it was the whole point. He was not offering to fight for her. He was offering to fight beside her, which was entirely different and entirely what she needed. She stopped walking. He stopped because she did. "I know," she said. "I know that now." She looked at him in the last of the light. This careful, quiet, steady man who had appeared at the edge of her life with his horse and his surveying instruments and his habit of reading things completely. And she thought that love was perhaps less dramatic than she had supposed. Not a lightning bolt, but something more like the Kansas light itself, arriving gradually, warming everything it touched until you could not remember being cold. She stepped toward him and he did not step back, and she put her hand against his chest and felt his heartbeat through the fabric of his jacket, and he put his hand over hers, not to move it but to keep it there. "Owen," she said. "Yes," he said. which was also the answer to the question neither of them had quite asked yet. She tilted her face up and he brought his head down, and the kiss was unhurried, not urgent, the kind of kiss that knows it is not the last one, and is made braver by that knowledge. It tasted of the evening air and felt like the particular relief of arriving somewhere you have been trying to reach for a very long time without a map. When they separated, the dusk had deepened around them and the first star was visible above the plain, sharp and clear in the enormous Kansas sky. "I have been extremely careful," he said, with a note of dry humor, "not to say this too soon." "And," she said. "And I've run out of patience for being careful about this particular thing," he said. "I am in love with you, Olive Rhodes." She felt the words settle over her like something she had been waiting for without knowing she was waiting. "I am in love with you," she said back, and it was the first time she had said those words to anyone, and she said them without hesitation because they were simply true. He smiled, the full smile she had been watching for since the first week, and put his arm around her shoulder as they started walking again toward town, and she leaned into him slightly, the way you lean into a wall you trust to hold. The summer moved forward with all the generosity of seasons that arrive after long winters of the heart. The irrigation survey was completed in July, and Owen's report was clear and unambiguous, as he had promised. The canal route was feasible, the benefit to the southern farmlands was significant, and the land acquisition cost was manageable with the county's existing infrastructure fund. He presented the report to Mayor Fitch in a meeting that also included Rafael Herrera and 2 other farmers from the bottomland who had come to ensure their interests were represented. Owen spoke with the same even precision he applied to everything, and when Fitch raised the question of land values along the canal route, Owen answered every specific concern with data that had been rigorously gathered and could not be conveniently disputed. Fitch approved the recommendation to move the project forward to the next phase. Rafael Herrera shook Owen's hand afterward and said something quietly in Spanish, and Owen responded in halting but genuine Spanish, and Rafael laughed and clapped his shoulder, and Olive watched from the doorway of the town hall and felt a pride in Owen that was not the lesser version of love but one of its clearest expressions. The physician from the Topeka medical program arrived in August, a young man named Dr. Samuel Bright, who was perhaps 25 and had completed his medical training the previous year, and had applied for a frontier placement with the particular idealism of someone who wanted to be somewhere he was genuinely needed. He was from Pennsylvania originally, serious-minded and slightly formal, but with a warmth underneath that came out when he was working. Olive brought him 3 meals during his first week before he had fully sorted his kitchen, which Clara Sims organized the housing for, and showed him the record she had compiled of medical incidents going back 4 years. He read it with the focused attention of a physician taking a case history, and when he finished he was quiet for a moment. "This is an extraordinary document," he said. "It's a record of what happens without adequate care," she said. "You should have been a public health advocate," he said. "I am one," she said, and he accepted that with a nod that was entirely serious. Owen proposed to her in September in the place where they had first held hands, in the bottomland south of town, where the creek ran and the grass grew thick, and the sky went on forever. He had the ring in his shirt pocket, a simple gold band he had bought on a trip to Abilene for survey materials, choosing it with the same care he gave everything, something beautiful without pretension. He did not get down on one knee because he knew she would find that theatrical, which she would. He simply stopped walking and turned to her and said, "I want to make a life here with you, a real one that lasts. Will you marry me, Olive?" And she said, yes, without any of the hesitation she might have expected to feel, because there was none, and she kissed him in the September light, and the creek ran past them as though it approved. They were married in November by the circuit preacher, Reverend Amos Lacey, who came through Harlan Creek on the second Saturday of every month, and performed the religious business of a frontier town with brisk, genuine conviction. The ceremony was held in the small community hall rather than the church, because the community hall could hold more people, and more people wanted to come than either of them had anticipated. Clara Sims organized the reception with the focused energy she brought to anything she genuinely wanted to succeed, which meant there was an abundance of food and a genuine warmth to the whole occasion. Rafael Herrera's wife brought enchiladas that were extraordinary, and Miss Vance played the piano with cheerful competence, and even Mayor Fitch appeared for an hour with his hat in his hand, and said something to the effect that Miss Rhodes had always been a credit to Harlan Creek, which was the closest he came to acknowledging anything. Olive wore a dress of pale blue that Clara had helped her find fabric for, altered and sewn by her own hands, and when Owen saw her in it before the ceremony, he stood entirely still for a moment, and then said very quietly, "You are the most remarkable woman I have ever known," and she said, "I know," which made him laugh, and they went in to be married. The winter settled over Harlan Creek after the wedding, and they were in it together now, the small house at the edge of town that was becoming their house in the way things do when two people fill a space with their combined presence. Owen's survey instruments occupied one corner of the main room. Olive's writing desk occupied another, with its neat stacks of correspondence and reference materials. The kitchen was reorganized in compromises that became new preferences, and the bed was warm with two people in it, and the long cold evenings were the best kind of long, full of talk and quiet, and the specific contentment of a home that feels earned. Dr. Bright was working well, and by December had treated 43 patients, and was already so embedded in the daily life of the town that it was difficult to remember the months before he had arrived. He had a particular skill with children, and seemed to have concluded that Harlan Creek was exactly the place he was meant to be, which Olive thought was just. Owen received an offer in January from a surveying company in Wichita that would have taken him north for 6 months on a major land survey. He told her about it the evening the letter arrived, sitting at the kitchen table with the lamp between them. "What do you want to do?" She asked because she asked him that, and he asked her that in return because that was how they operated. "I want to stay," he said. "The canal project needs finishing. There's other local survey work I could take on, and I am, it turns out, not interested in being 6 months from here." She looked at him steadily. "If it was something you wanted, it's not," he said simply. "I'm not saying I wouldn't travel for work, but not for 6 months and not away from this." He looked at her with the directness she had come to understand as his most basic form of honesty. "Not away from you." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. "All right," she said. "All right," he said. The canal construction began in the spring of 1879, and Owen was heavily involved in the engineering oversight, working alongside the construction foreman the county had brought in. He spent weeks in the field, and Olive sometimes rode out with Alice and sat on the bank above the work site with her correspondence, and they ate lunch together in the field with the sound of the work below and the enormous Kansas sky overhead. And she thought that this, the ordinary particular of being together in the middle of their respective work, was what love looked like when it had become its truest form. She had taken on a new project by spring, a campaign to establish a small school fund that would allow children from the bottomland farms to attend Miss Vance's school with proper materials, since many of them came without, and Miss Vance had been funding it partially out of her own modest salary, which was not a sustainable arrangement. Olive's method was by now familiar to the town: a carefully written proposal, a collection of signatures, an appeal to the appropriate fund. She had become someone people expected to organize these things, which was a change from the woman who had stood in the town hall with a folded petition while Gerald Fitch reached for his pipe. She was writing the school fund proposal at her desk one afternoon in March when she felt suddenly, distinctly unwell in a way that was not like illness but was like the beginning of something enormous and new. She sat with that for a moment, counting weeks, doing quiet arithmetic. Owen came home that evening to find her sitting in the kitchen with her hands in her lap and an expression he could not quite categorize. "Olive," he said, immediately reading her. She looked up at him. "I think we're going to need to talk to Dr. Bright," she said. He went very still. "Are you all right?" he said, and his voice had that careful quality it got when he was managing something large. "Yes," she said. "Very all right." She paused. "I think I'm with child." The stillness in him broke open into something she had no word for, pure and uncomplicated and bright. He crossed the room in 2 strides and knelt beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her with that full open face that he only ever showed her, that face without any of the reserve he wore in the world, just Owen, entirely present, entirely hers. "Are you certain?" he said. "Not entirely. That's why I said Dr. Bright." "Right." "Yes, tomorrow morning. Owen. We'll go first thing. He's usually an early Owen." She cupped his face with both her hands. "Are you happy?" He looked at her, and she felt his jaw move under her palms. "I am so profoundly happy," he said, "that I don't know what to do with myself." "You could sit down," she said. He sat down on the floor beside her chair, which was not the most dignified posture for a grown man, and she moved her fingers into his hair, and he leaned his head against her knee, and they stayed like that in the lamplight in their house, in the middle of their life together. And the Kansas night was large and quiet outside the windows. Dr. Bright confirmed it in the morning with the professional calm of someone who delivered good news regularly, and understood that it deserved its own kind of ceremony. He was thorough and careful and told her what to expect and when, and she listened and asked exactly the right questions, which he answered without condescension because he was a good doctor, and because she was clearly someone who required and deserved complete information. Owen waited outside and she came out and nodded, and he let out a slow breath. "November," she said. "He estimates November." He took her hand on the step of the doctor's house, right there in the Harlan Creek morning with Clara Sims watching from her boarding house window across the road, and he kissed her in plain view of anyone who cared to see it, which was not typically something either of them did but which felt entirely appropriate to the moment. Clara Sims called across from her window, "Congratulations to you both." And that was how the news got to the town, which was to say immediately and thoroughly. The summer of 1879 was full. The canal construction reached its first milestone and water flowed through the initial section to the Herrera farm in July, and Owen and Olive were both there when it happened, standing with the Herrera family in the field while the water came through the new channel for the first time. Rafael Herrera's wife wept quietly. Their eldest son, a boy of about 12, ran along the bank laughing. Owen had his hand on the small of Olive's back, where it had come to rest naturally in recent months with the particular care and attentiveness a man gives to the person carrying his child. She was visibly pregnant by July, which she wore with the same practical directness she applied to everything, without fuss, without performance. She continued her work on the school fund petition, which was nearly complete. She continued her correspondence with the Territorial Health Board, which had begun consulting her informally on medical access issues in frontier settlements, a development she found both validating and typical of how institutions operated, wanting the work without having wanted to do it themselves. Owen finished the first full irrigation survey report in August, a 60-page document that was clear and thorough, and contained a section on the long-term agricultural benefits to the existing farming families that no one could reasonably dispute. He submitted it to the county and the town simultaneously. Mayor Fitch thanked him and said it was fine work. The school fund petition was accepted in September, with less drama than the physician petition and more grace, perhaps because by now people in Harlan Creek had some experience of how Olive's proposals worked out. Miss Vance came to the house personally to thank her and ended up staying for tea and 2 hours of conversation about education and the particular challenges of frontier teaching, and when she left she said, "I have never met anyone who does what you do in quite the way you do it." And Olive said, "What do I do?" And Miss Vance said, You make people see what's right in front of them and pretend they always knew it was there," which was so accurate that Olive laughed. The baby came in November, in the middle of a night that was cold and clear, the kind of night where the stars are very bright and the world is very quiet. Dr. Bright was there, which was everything the situation had needed, calm and skilled and exactly right, everything Florence Garrett had not had. It was a boy. Owen was outside the bedroom door, because that was the custom of the time and because Dr. Bright had been gently firm about it. And when Olive's voice came through the door, changed in some way that was not quite pain and not quite anything else, Owen had his hand flat on the wall and was studying the grain of the wood with extraordinary attention. When Dr. Bright opened the door and said, "You have a healthy son, Mr. Talbot," Owen's face did something that Olive, from the bed, could see through the doorway, and it was the most unguarded thing she had ever witnessed in her life, a man absolutely undone by joy. He came in and she put the baby in his arms and watched him hold the small, wrapped weight of his son, with the careful, reverent precision of someone handling the most important thing in the world. The baby was dark-haired like Owen and had Olive's nose, which was a combination that Clara Sims, who came in the morning with a food basket, declared exactly right. They named him James Aldridge Talbot, the first name for Owen's father. The second, the middle name, for the Dr. Harlan Creek had lost in 1877, the absence that had started everything. Owen held the name James Aldridge Talbot up to the light of that reasoning and nodded once, the way he nodded at things that were correct. "Yes," he said, "that's his name." The winter of 1879 into 1880 was the quietest and fullest they had known. James was a solid, curious infant who slept in thoughtful intervals and woke with evident opinions. Owen was up in the night as often as Olive, not because she asked, but because he understood it as his part of the work, as natural to him as any other thing that needed doing. The canal project entered its second phase in the spring. Owen was appointed the official survey coordinator for the county's irrigation development program, a formal role that came with a proper fee and meant he had a legitimate professional stake in the region, not just a boarding house room he had once rented from Clara Sims, but an actual established life in a specific place. He built a proper office addition onto the house in the spring. Olive's writing desk moved into the new room, along with his drafting table and the large map frames he used for his survey work. They worked in that room in the mornings, both of them, in a comfortable parallel concentration that James, from his basket near the window, observed with the alert attention of a child who was going to be curious about everything. Mayor Fitch lost the 1880 election to a man named Erasmus Cole, who was younger and had not been in Harlan Creek long enough to have decided that everything was already settled. Cole's first act as mayor was to formally expand the Civic Health Fund, making Dr. Bright's salary a permanent budget line rather than a probationary allocation. His second act was to write a letter of acknowledgement to the County Health Board crediting the petition campaign that had begun the change. He brought the letter to Olive personally. She read it and looked up at him. "Thank you," she said. "It should have happened sooner," he said, with the simple acknowledgement of someone who had not been there to not do it, but understood the failure that had. "Yes," she said, "it should have." She kept the letter. She put it in the same box where she kept the draft of her original petition, all 8 pages in her careful handwriting, and the page Owen had torn from his notebook with the county charter citation, and the county's formal response with its official stamp. They were a small archive of what a person could do with a clear argument and the refusal to stop. Owen found her with the box one evening, sitting at her desk, not reading anything, just looking at it. "Are you all right?" he said from the doorway, James on his hip examining the doorframe with scientific interest. "Very all right," she said, "just thinking. About how much happened because one man read what I wrote," she said. He came into the room and sat on the edge of the desk with the ease of someone who has long since stopped being a guest in any space they share with the person they love. "And about how much already happened before that," he said. She looked up at him. 63 signatures, he said. 3 weeks of walking every road. 4 years of watching a town not do what it should. The arithmetic is mostly yours. The statute was yours, she said. The statute was a tool, he said for the second time and smiled. She reached up and took his free hand, the one not occupied with supporting James, who had found something on the doorframe that warranted serious investigation. "Owen," she said. "Yes." "I love you." "I know," he said, with the same tranquility he brought to all true things. "You're supposed to say it back," she said. "I say it back every morning," he said, "and usually around midday, and most evenings. I'm rationing the current instance." She laughed, the full, real laugh that he had heard the first time months into their friendship and had immediately understood to be one of the best sounds available to the human ear. "I love you," he said, without any further delay, looking at her with the steadiness that was perhaps his most fundamental quality. "I will love you until I cannot, and I expect that to be a very long time from now." "Good," she said. James, having resolved the doorframe question to his satisfaction, turned and looked at his parents with the expression of an infant who finds the general situation acceptable. The years that followed built on the foundation of what had been started in 1878, steadily and without interruption. The canal was completed in full by 1882, and the farmland south of Harlan Creek transformed over the following seasons in the way good water always transforms dry land. Rafael Herrera planted a second field, and his family's stability became the kind of stability that could be passed to the next generation, which was the whole point of infrastructure when it was done justly. Dr. Bright married Miss Vance in 1881, which surprised no one who had watched them at any town gathering for the previous 2 years, and Dr. Bright's small house became a small house with a better kitchen and a vegetable garden that benefited from Miss Vance's organizational instincts. Olive had a second child in 1882, a daughter they named Clara Josephine Talbot, the first name for Clara Sims, who had provided the kind of community that made a difficult thing easier, and the middle name for Owen's mother, who had died before Olive could meet her. Clara Josephine arrived with a degree of enthusiasm that suggested she had decided the world was interesting and intended to investigate it thoroughly, which proved accurate as she grew. James, at 3, received his sister with the gravity of someone who understands a significant development has occurred and is determining his position. Owen put them both to bed that night and came out to find Olive sitting in the good chair in the main room with a cup of tea and an expression of complete and settled satisfaction. "You look very pleased with yourself," he said. "I am extremely pleased with ourselves," she said. He sat down beside her and took her tea and drank some of it without asking, which was a privilege that had been established long ago. "Clara Josephine Talbot," he said. "It's a good name," she said. "It's a very good name," he agreed. He handed the tea back. Outside, the Kansas night was full of stars, the same stars that had been there in 1878 when she had sat on this porch alone and argued with the plane about why the world was so difficult, and they had not answered. But something else had answered, something that had arrived on a dark bay horse with one white sock, and had read 8 pages of her most careful thinking, and ridden across this particular portion of the American frontier to tell her what they said. In 1883, the county formally established a frontier medical access program modeled in part on the Harlan Creek case, citing it in the documentation as an example of successful civic advocacy. Olive was invited to present at a county health conference in Grover's Pass, which she did, with a clarity and precision that left the assembled officials nodding and taking notes, and looking slightly as though they wished they had thought of it themselves. Owen accompanied her, and sat in the 3rd row with James on one side and an empty chair for the child they'd arranged for Clara Sims to watch, and listened to his wife explain with perfect calm and complete authority the mechanisms by which frontier communities could and should provide medical access to their residents. He watched the people in the room listen to her, and saw the moment when a room stops waiting for a speaker to finish and starts actually hearing them, and felt the same thing he had felt in the Bottomland 4 years ago when she had ridden up to him with the county's letter. That particular satisfaction that belongs to recognizing what a person is and knowing you are the one they chose to come home to. Afterward, in the carriage back to Harlan Creek, with James asleep against Owen's side and the Kansas plane rolling past in the late afternoon gold, Olive said, "I think I'd like to write a formal guide for other towns, everything we learned. The petition process, the county charter provisions, the medical placement program. Something someone else could use without having to start from nothing." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "It might take me a year," she said. "You have more than a year," he said. "We have time." She leaned her head back against the carriage seat and looked out at the plains she had come to love, not despite their difficulty but including it, the way you love anything that has been the setting for your real life. "Owen," she said. "Yes. Are you happy?" It was the question she had asked in the kitchen, years ago, when everything was beginning and she had not yet known if happiness was something this particular life would contain. He looked at her with the steady, clear eyes that had read every word she had ever written to him and for him and because of him, and the eyes that had looked up at her in the Bottomland when she held a letter that meant she was not going to lose the fight, and the eyes that had found her on a porch in the dark the night the town meeting had gone the wrong way and seen her and stopped. "I am the happiest man I know," he said, "by a considerable margin." James stirred slightly and resettled without waking. The plane extended itself in every direction around the carriage, which was moving at a steady pace through the late Kansas afternoon, 2 people and a sleeping child and the accumulated weight of a life that had been built brick by brick, petition by petition, word by word, hand by hand. "So am I," Olive said. And that was true, and it continued to be true in the years that came after, in the small house that had grown by stages into a proper family home, in the town that had learned, slowly and sometimes reluctantly, to be a better version of itself. In the work that continued, because there was always more to do and Olive had never been the kind of person who stopped when there was more to do. In the evenings that became the structure of their life, Owen at the drafting table and Olive at the writing desk, the 2 children moving through the house with the particular energy of children who are loved and know it, and have not yet been given reason to doubt it. In the mornings Owen kissed her before anything else, before coffee or conversation or the consideration of what the day required. In the evenings she waited for the sound of his boots, which she knew as well as her own heartbeat, and felt the day settle into place around his arrival. The petition Olive had written, the one that had been set on a table unread, and had then been read by one person who had saddled a horse and ridden to find her in the morning, and told her what the document contained that she had not known to use. That petition lived in a wooden box on the shelf in the office room of their house, along with the county's formal response and Owen's handwritten note and everything that had followed. It was not a monument. It was a record of what a woman could do with a clear mind and a refusal to accept what was wrong, of what a man could do by reading carefully and taking something seriously that the world had decided not to take seriously, of what those 2 things together could make. Outside the window of the house where Owen Talbot and Olive Rhodes had made their life, the Kansas plain extended itself into the distance, honest and enormous and entirely indifferent to human scale. The sky above it, the particular blue that the frontier sky achieves in the late afternoon when the light is coming in low and everything is cast in gold. The creek ran south of town where the canal had been built to carry water to people who had needed it. The school on the East Road had good materials now. The doctor's house had a light in the window. The town was not perfect. It would never be perfect. But it was better, by specific and traceable measures, than it had been, and some of that could be counted in the number of people who were alive who might not have been, and some of it could be counted in the canal water reaching fields that had been dry, and some of it could not be counted at all, but was present anyway. The particular quality of a community that has learned to take its people seriously. James Aldridge Talbot grew up knowing the story of the Petition, because his mother told it matter-of-factly and without embellishment, as a thing that had happened and had required certain tools and a specific kind of persistence. He grew up watching his father read everything placed before him with complete attention, and understood from an early age that this was a form of respect. Clara Josephine Talbot grew up knowing that her mother had changed things, and that her father had read every word, and that these were not separate stories but the same story, and that it was the one her whole life was built on. Owen Talbot grew old in Harlan Creek, with the patience and steadiness he had always brought to the places he found himself, except that he had never before brought it somewhere he truly wanted to stay. He surveyed land and drew maps, and the county grew around the work he had done, and the water ran in the channels he had planned, and none of it was as important as the particular view from his own porch, which was Olive in the evening light with her papers and her tea, thinking about the next thing that needed doing. Olive Rhodes Talbot, which was the name she wrote at the bottom of every document for the rest of her life, published her Guide for Frontier Civic Advocacy in 1884. It was read in county offices across Kansas and in the territorial legislature in Topeka, and eventually copied and sent further than she had intended. She did not know, for many years, how many times it was used. Occasionally, a letter came from a distant town saying something had worked, and she kept those letters in a second box beside the first one. On the evening of her 38th birthday, Owen found her at her desk reading one of those letters, from a settlement in the Oklahoma Territory, where a woman named Ellen had used Olive's guide to secure a school for her community, and Olive was reading it with the particular expression she wore when something had arrived that she had not known she was waiting for. Owen stood in the doorway and watched her, and the children were in bed, and the house was quiet, and the Kansas night was pressing gently against the windows. "Good news," he said. She looked up and her face was bright. "Very good news," she said. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her desk, which was where he had always sat when he came to find her there, and she handed him the letter, and he read it, every word, the way he always read everything she gave him, completely, with full attention, as though it were the most important thing in front of him, because when she gave him something, it was. He set the letter down and looked at her. "Ellen from Oklahoma Territory," he said. "Ellen from Oklahoma Territory," she confirmed. He picked up her hand from the desk and held it the way he had held it in the bottomland years ago, the first time, when everything was beginning, certain and gentle and entirely without hesitation. "To Ellen from Oklahoma Territory," he said. "And to everyone else," she said. "And to everyone else," he agreed. The lamp burned between them in the small room full of maps and papers and the accumulated intelligence of two people who had built something real and lasting from a folded petition and a notebook page and the simple, transformative act of being seen. Outside, the Kansas night was vast and still, and the stars were doing what stars in Kansas have always done, burning with clear, indifferent light over the plain that does not remember anyone but holds, in its water and its roads and its soil, every mark that a person ever made on it with care and intention. Theirs were still there, and that was enough. That was, in fact, everything.